Partner Violence Against Men by Ashley Hansen. Introduction. Intimate partner violence against men is an almost never talked about type of interpersonal violence. Societal structures and expectations of abuser and victims have been deemed as men are the violators and women and children are the victims. It is because of this flawed societal norm that it is important to research why the stigma associated with being a male victim is seldomly discussed. It is important to research this type of intimate partner violence so that resources can be developed to provide male victims with community resources and assistance with navigating the justice system for protection. I don't know about you, but I can't even think of one domestic violence shelter that I know of in our community that exists solely for men who are trying to seek shelter from an abusive relationship from their wife or significant other. Furthermore, this research can potentially reduce the stigma and biasness men face when seeking assistance in their community when attempting to leave abusive relationships. Intimate partner violence. The definition of intimate partner violence refers to and defines the word spouse to include someone related by marriage to the offender, as well as any unrelated adult living with the offender who performs spousal roles, such as unmarried adults who live together. And what I found interesting in putting together this presentation was that when I was looking for the clip art to include, I was only able to find like 3 images that pertain to domestic violence against men. All of it, even though I had entered male victims of domestic violence, it was all showing up as women being the victims, and to stand up against women or female abuse and marriage abuse against women. And so I think that's an important thing to be able to see, is that there's not a lot of media that speaks up against male victims. And again, this falls back onto the institutional norms that women are always the victims and that men are always the aggressors. And when social media and the news and all of those societal institutions don't, utilize their platform to speak up against intimate partner violence against men, then it just kind of falls to the wayside, and we are perpetrating and almost instigating that this violence continues. Here we are at the literature review, and the first study focused on the role that law enforcement can play in promoting victim assistance programs for male victims of intimate partner violence, also known as IVP. Through the use of police data, the study found that victim sex differences do in fact exist. Comparing male and female victims across lethal and non-lethal intimate partner violence can provide a better understanding of these incidents and assist policymakers in developing more tailored victim services and prevention programs. And again, like I had stated earlier, there is hardly any tailored victim services that are geared towards men. Where are those prevention programs? I mean, there are tons of evidence-based models that are out there that are preventative programs that increase the awareness of preventing domestic violence against women. So furthermore, Addington and Pyramine Cheney sought to investigate why feminist criminologists supported the perspective that IPV is gendered or asymmetrical violence and primarily a male on female phenomenon. What? Under this view, male victims are generally characterized as the original abusers, and their female offenders are the previous victims who fight back, and how this framework has resulted in minimal assistance and programs aimed at supporting male victims. So again, we're seeing that this is an institutional framework. This is an institutional um, way of thinking, and it has, in essence, kind of like uh, formed the way that we think about intimate partner violence on a micro and macro level. Because for the males, they're not speaking up because they know that there's not a lot of resource out there for them. And both men and women view males to be primarily the aggressor rather than the victim. Study explored equal protection issues in family law by evaluating gender and violence profiles of a random sample of 157 temporary restraining orders involving intimate partners in a California district court. The author's study concludes that judges were 13 times more likely to grant a TRO requested by a female plaintiff against her male intimate partner than a temporary restraining order requested by a male plaintiff against his female partner, implicating that judicial responses to TRO's request discriminate against male victims of domestic violence. And again, where is this coming from? This is coming from our institutional bias against men being victims. The next study was very intriguing. So, this study highlights the feminization of the social welfare system as playing a huge role in society's inability to see men as victims of domestic violence. Again, we're seeing the institutional aspect being what's being identified as the biggest perpetrator of these roles, right? And the biggest perpetrator of the stigma. So, author Ronald Hall acknowledges that male victims of domestic violence are attributed less to personal preference and more to the cultural traditions of the Western patriarchy. Hall further suggests an effective tool to reducing the stigmatization of male victims in need of services is application of more objective policy models which better locate the role and culture in the perception and attention to all victims in need. So, this next research study found that approximately 3.8 women and 1.3 men per 1,000 are victims of intimate partner violence each year. Even though collaborative professions to criminal justice such as nursing, social work, counseling, and psychology have begun to discuss male victims of intimate partner violence, scholars within criminal justice have conducted limited empirical research, which has revealed the need for further studies by criminologists. This article examined literature concerning the male victims of domestic violence by their female intimate partners. Unfortunately, intimate partner violence policy has constituted limits to the male victims of this crime. The criminal justice system continues to ignore issues arising from this steadily growing problem. In this article, the male victim's experience has been described through the conflict theoretical perspective as the experience in relation to American society and its criminal justice system. This article examines this problem through a review of literature. And as I've expressed in past research and assignments throughout this course, I am a huge believer and follower of the conflict theoretical perspective. I do believe, and it's validated by much of this research in this study thus far, that it's the institutional structures within our society that blame men as being aggressors. So if they're aggressors, they can't be victims, right? So we stay stuck in this stigma. This review gains more insight into the problems male victims encounter. This study investigated the characteristics of adult male victims of domestic violence using an online questionnaire regarding the characteristics of abuse. The study found that the most important reason for men not to report abuse is the belief that police would not take action. The findings suggest that society should be aware that men are victims and desire and feel the need to talk about their abuse. And what a powerful image, right? Showing a man who is feeling forced to not speak up, right? There's been tape placed over his mouth. He has an image to uphold. Society has deemed him to be this manly man who, in no way, shape, or form, can come out as being a victim, especially at the hands of a woman. Method, secondary analysis. In order to address my hypothesis, that society's preconceived gender roles of men being the abusers create a stigma that prevents men from speaking up about being victims of intimate partner violence. In utilizing secondary data analysis, this researcher was able to locate reliable studies that address the question of why, and researcher was able to identify institutional barriers that further created an increase of stigma for male victims. The limitations that were faced was a lack of literature and data as to the exact cause of male silence, as exampled by shame, guilt, embarrassment, fear, intimidation, about intimate partner violence. There is very limited research on the topic, and this too created many barriers. I thought I would find similar research to that of women victims that would highlight data surrounding the cycle of abuse and or mental emotional effects caused by trauma from intimate partner violence. However, no literature could be found. As we've seen, it was all falling back on the institutional structures. Analysis of the data. Much of the existing research found that men are less likely to speak of being victims of intimate partner violence because they know that police, law enforcement, judges, and social services are less likely to believe they are victims of abuse, even though 1.3 men per 1,000 are victims of intimate partner violence each year. Now, think of that on a national scale. That's actually a lot of men that are victims, but we don't hear about it unless I can only think of maybe one or two times that I heard on the news where a wife killed her husband, right? But it all turned out through court proceedings that she claimed to be a victim of domestic violence and thus reacted in a way that she was in self defense, right? We never hear about men victims. Much of the research focused on the feminization of society's institutions and how this has caused discriminatory practices against male victims and reduced community resources for victims, exemplified by domestic violence shelters, temporary restraining orders, and emergency welfare services. Now, like I said earlier, I can't even think of one domestic violence shelter in my region that is for men. And I think this might also come down to the fact that we are so familiar with just women being victims that, you know, when you work in behavioral health or DPSS, social services, law enforcement, you become very familiar with those resources that exist in the community that are geared towards helping women. But I can't think of any that are there in place for male victims. So again, that's going to reduce the likelihood of a male victim seeking help because there's just no resources out there. So the data validated that my hypothesis was correct, as institutional stigma created a barrier for men to speak about their abuse. It is for this reason future research should focus on the implementation of evidence-based models in serving male victims of IPV. These models should reduce biasness that our law enforcement, social services, and judicial systems carry, similar to a trauma-informed care model. So trauma-informed care, right, teaches those who work in law enforcement, judicial healthcare, mental health, behavioral health, how to show empathy, compassion, and utilize community resources when providing trauma-informed care to individuals. And so I think that the trauma-informed model would be a good model for future research to be implemented to provide those trauma-informed care um, to male victims of intimate partner violence. Conclusion: while early definitions of spouse abuse concentrated on damaging physical violence, conceptions broadened as the situation gained recognition as a national problem. Reports of spousal abuse may now include sexual abuse, marital rape, and even the use of pornography. Research has further associated certain conditions with spouse abuse, such as alcohol consumption, economic stress, and education, etc. The research data collected highlights a strong connection between conflict theory and the stigma associated with male victims of intimate partner violence. When the state judicial system fails to enact or protect a male victim, it is perpetuating the societal norm that women are weak victims and thus places them as a minority group. This, in essence, protects the desired social order, further validating the feminist theory that men are the original aggressors who, after their female victims have had enough, will engage in violence as means of protection. So now we go on to the Christian worldview, and for this slide, I decided to go with Galatians 3:28 because for me, no other scripture best handles just putting us all as one in the eyes of Christ. So Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ. The gendered society places roles, expectations, and expected behaviors on both men and women. This creates a perception of what is and isn't possible for a deviant act. The Christian worldview reminds us that we are all the same in the eyes of Christ. If we are to protect those who are victims, we must be willing to be more Christ-like in our judgments, recognizing that both men and women are capable of becoming victims of intimate partner violence. So in ending, I really want to highlight that it's our culture and it's our institutional structures that perpetuate this idea that men cannot be victims, especially at the hands of women. And that's just not true. There needs to be more research and there needs to be more evidence-based models implemented to provide male victims the community resources, the empathy, the compassion that they deserve. And because, I mean, we saw in the slides that 1.3 out of every 1,000 American is a male victim of intimate partner violence. That means that there's a problem. And so with that, I was very passionate about my research, and I really hope that there is further discussion, further awareness, and advocacy that men be seen as victims of domestic violence just the way a female is. So with that, I thank you for watching this video, and I hope that you have a blessed holiday, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. And I look forward to hopefully having you as a professor in future classes. Thank you. And here we have references.